And I know you're as anxious as I am to get into close action. But we must bring him right up beside us before we spring this trap. That will test our nerve. And discipline will count just as much as courage.
The Age of Fighting Sail. Part 7. At Last, Naval Innovation. After de Grasse surrendered, Rodney was generous and courteous to him, even though he had formerly labeled him as a rascal and a nuisance. The French admiral was allowed to stay in Rodney's cabins, and professed himself in love with the Mrs. Rodney as soon as the portraits of Rodney's 4 daughters were restored to the admiral's cabin from the wine room, where they had been stored during the battle. During the pleasant, peaceful days following the battle, de Grasse strolled the Formidable's quarterdeck, watching the sailors catch a shark and chatting with Fleet Captain Douglas. Despite his stay in Paris, Rodney's French was limited, but Douglas was a French scholar. The French admiral confided that he had to leave his private fortune, amounting to £5,000, in a chest aboard the Ville de Paris, and was concerned that the chest might be looted by his sailors. Rodney quickly sent some British sailors over to the Ville de Paris. They returned with de Grasse's chest and a few others as well. For weeks after the Battle of the Saints, and for more than a century since, controversy has persisted. Sir Samuel Hood argued that Rodney should have followed up his victory by pursuing the remainder of the French fleet. Rodney, however, had not slept for 4 nights. Darkness was falling swiftly as it does in the tropics, and there would be no moon that night. The ships were not far from the shoals and reefs of the islands. The French had done their usual damage to the British rigging. Rodney had had enough, and he did not want to risk losing one of his ships or any of the prizes that he had captured. By the next morning, when Hood came aboard the Formidable to urge a chase, the surviving ships of the French fleet were already below the horizon. With understandable satisfaction, Rodney dispatched a fast frigate to London with the message that read, "It has pleased God, out of his divine providence, to grant his Majesty arms a most complete victory." Englishmen reacted to Rodney's news with pent-up hysteria. It was the Royal Navy's most decisive victory since the naval engagements of the 7 Years' War. Rodney was rewarded with a peerage and an income of £2,000 a year. Hood was also given a peerage, and 2 more of Rodney's captains were knighted. At the Battle of the Saints, Rodney had launched a new day in naval warfare. Since the 7 Years' War, British admirals had fought the enemy in the line-ahead formation and had never won so decisive a victory until Rodney cut through the enemy's line off Dominica. His victory was compounded of other elements besides the new tactics. A major contributor was Rodney's fleet captain, Sir Charles Douglas. There is some doubt among scholars whether Douglas had actually talked Rodney into adopting Clerke's tactics, but Clerke later claimed that he had personally demonstrated his maneuvers to Douglas in London before the Battle of the Saints. Douglas deserves much of the credit for other reasons. He was a brilliant innovator who markedly improved the British rate of fire. Douglas substituted flannel for the silk powder cartridges. Flannel was much more flammable than silk, and thus left no smoldering remnants in the breech of the cannon, which in turn meant the elimination of the additional step of trying to extricate the still-burning cartridge fragments. Another Douglas innovation was to moisten the wads between powder and ball, this also reducing the possibility of their igniting and the need to extricate. Yet a third Douglas improvement was a perforated goose quill filled with powder. It could be thrust into the cannon touch hole much more quickly and efficiently than the old method of pouring a portion of powder from a horn. Hundreds of these goose quills were ready for instant use in the Battle of the Saints. Among the most important of Douglas's contributions was one that materially increased the rate of fire. He devised a system of lead springs and weights that worked to absorb the recoil of the cannon and made their return to firing position much easier and quicker. But the greatest Douglas invention was an intricate block and tackle arrangement that enabled a crew to aim a gun with greater accuracy and flexibility. Besides the wedges that had lifted or lowered the muzzle, Douglas's tackle permitted a wider arc when training the gun. Douglas's reforms enabled gun crews to aim as much as 45 degrees in either direction. When approaching an enemy, they could get in as many as 3 shots before the enemy was in a position to reply, and when departing, they could deliver an equal sting after the enemy had been forced to cease fire. At the Battle of the Saints, the gunners of de Grasse's flagship, the Ville de Paris, were dumbfounded by the concentrated fire they were receiving. The British had yet another surprise for the French. On his last visit to England, Rodney had been introduced to a devastating new weapon. It was a large, short-barreled gun called the carronade because of its origin at Scotland's Carron Iron Works. Mounted on a track that provided more friction than wheels of a ship's gun, thus reducing the recoil, the wide-muzzled carronade could fire a monster 68-pound ball with a 5.5-pound powder cartridge. The carronade was useless at long range, but murderous close up. And because the island of Dominica prevented the French line from falling away, most of the Battle of the Saints was fought at close range. When the Formidable went through de Grasse's line, Rodney's carronades accomplished more damage and slaughter than a dozen big guns could have caused at a distance. Of the 5 French ships that were captured, 3 were the victims of the carronades blasting into their sterns. With the aid of these technological, strategical, and tactical advances, Sir Charles Douglas, Lord Rodney, and John Clerk had formed an unlikely triumvirate to alter the tactics of fighting sail forever. Rodney praised Douglas, but did not mention Clerk at all in his report on the Battle of the Saints. But on his return to London, he acknowledged his debt to the amateur admiral of Edinburgh by contributing to an edition of Clerk's book a series of self-revealing footnotes. One reads, "The naval instructions want a thorough reformation, but 'tis not in the power of every commander-in-chief to make what additions he pleases." And another reads, "There will ever be a manifest advantage in obliging your enemy to depart from their original intention and attacking them in a different mode from what they offer you." What Rodney was suggesting, in a word, was surprise. Splitting the enemy's line and doing the unexpected would be the tactic adopted by a new generation of fighting admirals who are only now stepping into the quarterdecks of the Royal Navy. And it was just in time, because the Royal Navy's greatest challenge of all was about to arise.